is cold out. Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky and where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, it's Magic Sound Fabric, Odds and Ends. So, I know this hasn't been a particularly popular series and not a lot of people are going to bother watching this whole video, but I'm not yet done talking about the work of Cameron Limbrick. There's still 6 more albums to his name that I haven't properly discussed, and for the sake of completion, I will be talking about each of them briefly in this video. There's one Magic Sound Fabric album I didn't give a video due to its unavailability, being Unfold. He has 3 albums under the name Mind Transport Tools called Tone Cone, Astral Bridge, and Fractal Labyrinth, and 2 albums under the name Olulo called Ego Hacker and Mind Power. And his Spiralite label has a couple of random meditation tapes and a weird EP of Christmas song covers done in his usual style, but I'm not going to go into those. This video is focusing on those above mentioned remaining 6 albums. And since I don't have any new insights on his music to share in a proper top 10 video that usually ends my discography reviews, I'm gonna be tagging the top 10 onto the end of this video without commentary. So let's get into this odds and ends, starting out with Unfold. So this is the real debut album of Magic Sound Fabric, released in 1998, several years before Uplift Drift. The reason it didn't get a proper video is, as mentioned before, its unavailability. It's not on any streaming platform or iTunes or available digitally anywhere. Though, I'm almost certain it was a long time ago, since I remember buying it digitally years ago off some other site, and obviously have heard the album without owning the CD, but never mind that. I don't remember where I actually got it from anymore. Point is, if you want to hear Unfold legally right now, at the moment, the only option is buying the CD from his website, and that in itself makes it a really difficult one to recommend. But I have heard the album, and I have formed opinions on it, so I'll be talking about it here. And, it's a weird one. I get the feeling Limbrick is kind of embarrassed by this album, and is kind of distancing himself from it, hence its lack of availability. I can kinda sorta see why, honestly. The production sounds way cheaper, a lot of stock MIDI type sounds on here, and what's more, Limbrick sings on several tracks. I mean, he did that on later albums too, and I've expressed my opinion on that already, as seen on albums like Observer, but on this particular one, he still sounds like a teenager. I don't know if he actually was, but he sounds like one. The lyrics are about the same kind of things he usually talks about, new age stuff, out-of-body experiences, but there is something kind of immature about the way he tackles these topics here. I don't think that's the right word to use, but basically it's a lot harder to take seriously than anything he did afterwards. He's still obviously going about it with absolute sincerity, but his teenage singing voice and the cheap production undercut the experience he's trying to convey. The album comes off pretty silly and campy. He's basically whatever is the 1998 equivalent of an obscure Bandcamp artist now. All that said, enjoyment-wise, Limbrick still delivered a pretty solid album here. I think there's really only one track where the silliness just undercut the experience entirely for me, being Yellow Honey. It's kind of hard to take a track seriously with lyrics like, "The rocks are speaking, the bee has the key, yellow honey is all that I can see." And Limbrick's delivery here especially just kind of makes me crack up more than anything, like even he can't totally take seriously what he's saying. But on the flip side to that argument, you have the track "Baby I Saw a UFO," which despite also being pretty silly sounding, probably even more so, here it comes off genuinely charming. There's just a sense of childlike wonder to it from his delivery where he just sounds so excited about the prospect of aliens visiting Earth, to even the instrumental with all of its jangly acoustic guitars and spacey little synth bleeping. I've never heard Limbrick sound quite so happy as he did on here. Well, this and the album closer New Plane, which is more directly about his out-of-body experience, but Baby I Saw a UFO also has the benefit of being really catchy on top of that. It may be silly, but I really love it, and that track alone is just absolutely worth checking out. It's cute. And while I'm at it, there is one other track from Unfold that I genuinely love. The Light is in You. It's a more instrumental-heavy track, aside from a little bit of singing at the very end. And I really like how this track just has like a really interesting progression to it. It feels like it has 3 parts or something. Starting out with some saxophone sounds over some ambient synth and piano in the first part, some more danceable piano lines, more rhythmic percussion, and eastern flutes on top for the second part. And finally the ending where everything just switches over into some more minor keys and Limbrick sings the title a few times, even sounds kind of sad. But it still manages to be pretty catchy despite the non-linearity of the track. The light is in you. So yeah, love that track as well. As for everything else, my 2 other favorite tracks I didn't already mention are probably the 10-minute opener, Cosmic Egg, which is a pretty solidly dramatic introduction to this album, and Liquid Light, which has some wordless vocals layered on top of his usual funky-ish synth blend, and creates some pretty enjoyable atmosphere. There are plenty of other instrumentals here that are basically like the stuff on his later albums, but cheaper sounding. They were all decently enjoyable, some more than others, but most of them don't really have much to actually discuss. I guess Cactus Garden was a highlight that I didn't mention before, I don't know. But as far as individual tracks go, that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic of Unfold. All in all, I will have to admit it's probably not an album that's super worth going out of your way for unless you've already gotten into his other stuff and are curious to hear where he started. If you've not heard any previous Magic Sound Fabric albums, this is not a good place to start. That's another reason it didn't get a proper video. But I still think it's a good album, all things considered. Sure, there's 1 track that borders on cringy, but there's 2 tracks I wholeheartedly love, a couple of others I like a lot, and there's nothing outright bad on here either. It is probably the worst Magic Sound Fabric album by merit of having such cheap production and Limbrick's inconsistent teenager voice. I can't say that Unfold is an absolute must-listen, and I can see why Limbrick seems to want to distance himself from it. But I also can't say you should outright avoid it, or that I don't still put it on every now and then. It definitely has some value as a curiosity. Once you understand its context, it becomes easier to get into, and it makes him that much more interesting an artist to talk about. So, you know, I can't deny I still pretty consistently have fun with Unfold, so I'll leave it at that. It's a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Moving on from there, we got his first album under the name Mind Transport Tools called Tone Cone. This came out in 1999, in pretty close proximity to Unfold and still a while before Uplift Drift, but it is a very different beast. Basically, this is just a straight ambient release. No lyrics, no beats, no rhythms, just mostly formless synth progressions and simplistic pads. And the song lengths are much longer too, 6 minutes, 8 minutes, several 10+ minute pieces as well. The production quality is admittedly not much better than Unfold, still clearly didn't have very good equipment yet at this point, and you can still hear stock MIDI sounds and all that stuff. But the pure ambient nature of this album makes it much easier to take seriously. Kind of like Carbon-Based Lifeform's pre-debut album, The Path. It's not precisely a complicated album that offers much to discuss. I guess it's intended as a bit of a tribute to some early period Tangerine Dream, but he finds a way to make it his own. Of the 7 tracks on here, most of these don't really have that much to them. Usually like 1 or 2 ambient pads with a filter or 2 on them. Some occasional textures here and there, and like there's some sounds of a stream in a meadow or something, or some of those Rainmaker things. And some tracks seem to evolve more over time, while others not as much. Flooding Light and Flight, for instance, have quite a few parts to them. The latter stuck out as maybe the biggest highlight to me, with all its menacing atonal walls of bit-crushed white noise, I guess, going up against solo pianos and transitioning into more dramatic territory with formless tinkly percussion and other various spacey textures. But other tracks not as much. The 2 parts of Star Clusters basically stick with 1 texture and sound throughout, and that's about it. Maybe the most interesting moment on here is the closer, Mystic Quest, where there's a bit of a shift into some MIDI orchestral sounds, making it sound like the soundtrack to some spooky area in a 16-bit RPG. It does feel the tiniest bit out of place. Nothing like that was really explored previously on the album, but it still works alright, and I enjoyed it nonetheless. it was nice to have some proper melodic sections like that. So yeah, overall, Tone Cone is a fairly solid and well put together ambient album. The production could be better, but I like the change of pace from the usual sounds that Limbrick always focuses on. This is a pretty refreshing album, and it's definitely worth a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Alright then, that leaves his most recent projects to talk about. After Lucid came out, Limbrick released 4 more albums in the following 2 years. In fact, only just a month after Lucid, we got this debut project from the alias Olulo, Ego Hacker. And only a month after that, the second Olulo album, Mind Power, came out. Considering Limbrick typically waits a few years before releasing new albums, I'll admit I was a bit caught off guard by the speed of these, and skipped them at the time. All his post-Lucid projects I've only heard for the first time around the time I started this series about a month ago, so I'll admit they're not even close to as embedded into my life as the main Magic Sound Fabric albums, and haven't had the time to properly grow on me. So, you know, there might be a bit of bias in favor of those other ones, but still. I've listened to Ego Hacker like 4 times so far. It's gotten a little better with each listen, and it may blossom into something more special with more time, but honestly, I don't think this album is truly the best work that Limbrick can do. This entire Olulo project seems to take his usual style and focus more on the sharper, more IDM-ish side of his sound. Every synth note is very calculated and precise, though the rhythms, melodies, and progressions for the most part really aren't much different from what he'd already done. And this specific focus on one particular side of his sound does admittedly lead to an album experience that's not quite as dynamic or interesting as he's usually able to deliver. I hate to say it, but the fact that this was released so quickly after Lucid kinda shows. This album doesn't feel like it had quite as much effort put into it, and it's very clearly a side project. There's even tracks here that just reprise sounds from earlier on in the album. The tracks Astral Plasm, Nobody But Mind, and No Distance Travel all have really, really similar synth patterns, to the point of feeling like remixes of each other, and they're just, you know, kind of taking up space, being redundant. I imagine this change of pace was at least partially inspired by the work of a colleague of his by the name of 01. That's another super underrated downtempo artist I really like and discovered around the same time as Magic Sound Fabric. He also typically focuses on the more precise electronic sound of this kind of dub chill-out structure. His music is the kind of thing that makes you feel like you're floating in some kind of virtual computerized space, and I get that exact same vibe out of Ego Hacker, but with a bit less flavor. Again, that's not to say it's bad by any stretch. Lack of originality isn't exactly a crime, and I do happen to love 01 on the side. There just isn't much I got out of Ego Hacker that I couldn't already get out of a previous release from him or 01. As far as individual tracks go, I'll admit there isn't really much for me to say since the structure and sounds are pretty uniform throughout, but I can list a few highlights. My favorites are the opener Victorious, Take a Look, Sea of Living Light, and Dimension Drifter. The latter is, again, totally a 01 type track, the noisier but still smooth synth tones and the 192.618 voice sample are totally hallmarks of his sound, but I digress. I enjoyed that regardless. So yeah, overall, I mean, I got mixed feelings on this album. On first listen, I found it to be really dull and monotonous and like a watered-down version of his usual stuff, but as I'm getting more familiar with it, I'm enjoying it more and more. So even if I'm iffy on it now, there's certainly promise for the future of me warming up to this album more. It's not essential, there's nothing here to go out of your way for or that you couldn't already get elsewhere, but it's cool. It's cool. I think I'm probably feeling like a 6.7 out of 10 on this. Now, the good news about Olulo is that I think the second album under the alias, Mind Power, was notably better. Better refined its sound, and despite still being stylistically similar to other chill-out artists I already listened to, as mentioned above, I think it did a better job of establishing its own definitive sound separate from Magic Sound Fabric and from those other artists. It's still inherently a side project and not one that I have a lot of definitive thoughts on every track, but it's at least an improvement from what came before. What I like about this album is that despite sonically being really similar to Ego Hacker, obviously, there are some genuinely really strange moments on this thing that I don't think I would have seen coming on a regular Magic Sound Fabric album. Well, there's mainly one moment on this album that sticks out above all the rest. The track Hocus Focus structurally not much different from any other track from this project, or from Limbrick in general, but the melodies and harmonies themselves are really sour and sound like everything is just clashing with each other. It's like a Magic Sound Fabric track in Bizarro World, and all the clashing harmonies are so disorienting that the whole album is kind of thrown off and ends up weirdly unsettling just as an entire whole. And for what it's worth, it's not just that one track. The kind of darker vibe is kept up by some, more strangely dark passages in a track like Feel Freakin' Alive and the title track from here, or foreshadowed slightly by some brief, almost shrill off-key chord stabs on I Wake. But I'll admit, it is primarily that one track that just had me looking over my shoulder the whole time going from there. Now, there's admittedly nothing in the album's presentation to suggest this was the effect he was actually going for, but the fact that I get disoriented by a track composed by Cameron Limbrick, the guy who's always about ease of mind and that kind of thing, is doubly disorienting in and of itself. I welcome the change of pace, subtle as it might be. The entire album isn't that consistently disorienting, though. Maybe there's tiny little moments in other tracks, but there's still tracks like Shadow Groove or Hey Mr. Spaceman, which don't feel that different from anything on Ego Hacker. Lighter and more soothing tracks, more typical to his style. Also, the latter is easily the catchiest track under any of these post-Lucid side projects. It's probably a good sign when I woke up this morning with that vocal line repeating through my head. Hey, Mr. Spaceman, hey, Mr. Spaceman. Hey. So, yeah, that's cool too. Overall, Mind Power is a strange album and one that really subtly made me question his intentions. But whether he intended for it to be off-putting like that, I'll take it as a plus anyway. Without that element of disorientation, it'd basically just be a rehash of stuff I'd already heard from him, and I like that there was a definite experience you can get here you can't get from any of his other releases. So yeah, I like it. I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this one too. Right, so Limbrick took a bit of a longer break than the ones between Olulo projects for his next release, and in 2016 he revived the old Mind Transport Tools alias with an album called Astral Bridge. Now, like on Tone Cone, many of these tracks stretch on for over 10 minutes, and none are shorter than 7. Yeah, I know Tone Cone had one shorter than 7, but whatever. But Astral Bridge really is not the same kind of album, really at all. More than anything, it's kind of like a regular Magic Sound Fabric album, with more focus on some of those, smoother synth textures, and also a lot less changes or evolves over time. On one hand, that is kind of a more ambient, perhaps Eno-esque approach to the compositions, more about creating a singular, consistent atmosphere where the concept of time doesn't matter than construction and variety within the tracks themselves. In fact, this album is going out of its way to make the experience more unified, with some tracks seeming to blend into each other and build on patterns from the tracks that came right before it. Moving through walls especially. Thing is though, Mind Transport Tools becomes a pretty apt name for this project. It's the kind of thing I listen to, and my mind wanders away from the music, transported away while the album falls in the background. Yeah, I feel like I at least get what Limbrick was going for, and I wanted to give this album a higher recommendation. I can see its place, but I don't think it really resonated with me on a deeper level. And it's not a repeat listens thing either. Honestly, the more I listened to Astral Bridge, the less I enjoyed it. I think the trouble is that the actual vibe Limbrick created here is, as mentioned before, really not that far a cry from what he usually does. It sounds like his usual sound, but with less detail. That's not to say it didn't still have its moments. I like some of the major key progressions of Light Ribbons. Frequency had some cool darker ambient passages and did a decent job of justifying its length. And the closer, Electric Diamond, that was a pretty stimulating finish and among the most easily recognizable moments from this thing. There's no bad tracks, but most of this album blends together in a singular blur that I find quite difficult to give my full attention to. When I listen to a Magic Sound Fabric album, there may be tracks that run long or don't change up all that much, like We Are All Connected from Freedom Star, for instance, doesn't have that wide a variety of patterns, but I still enjoy that whole thing, but more because, A, it doesn't sound like the other tracks around it, and it's also surrounded by two tracks that sound less happy and evolve a lot more over time than this particular collection. production does. Even Tone Cone, despite its lack of beats or rhythms, still evolved and changed quite a bit more than this one does, and even in the moments that it didn't as much, it could still keep me interested in other ways. Primarily through the fact that it sounds so different from his other stuff. Astral Bridge seems kind of plain by his standards. Having been listening to a lot of his stuff in a short amount of time has made it difficult for me to give it a pass purely by following his usual style alone. Well, I don't know. Astral Bridge is certainly not a bad album. I can totally believe the sameness was 100% intentional. It's still the kind of thing I can easily recognize as Cameron Limbrick's work from a distance. If I wasn't as familiar with his work, I don't know if I'd have this same, reaction to it, but I don't know. I just don't see myself putting this on much when I have his other Magic Sound Fabric albums around that I feel are just more dynamic and stimulating experiences. So yeah, Astral Bridge is just a 6.5 out of 10. And that leaves one more album to talk about here, the sequel to Astral Bridge called Fractal Labyrinth. And once again, I see it as a noticeable improvement from what was on there. In terms of progression over time, once again, there's not exactly a lot, but the key element that raises this album up is the fact that it has a different enough sound to it to distinguish from what he had before. The structure of this album is very similar to Astral Bridge. A lot of the tracks sound similar and run together, trying to go along with an ambient-centric mindset without being straight ambient. But the sounds involved in the entire album are a lot lighter and breezier, everything is noticeably smoother. A lot of these tracks make me feel like I'm floating way up in the sky or in some kind of vast, bright expanse. Again, it's not a super far cry from his usual sound, kind of hard to describe in words how it steps away from the usual from him, but it's a step away at least. There is an experience to be gleaned from this album that you can't get out of his other ones. Like with Astral Bridge, there's not a lot to say from an individual track basis. I guess the track Deep Realization had these nice xylophone-ish tones that stood out to me and probably made that moment the most personally impactful, but otherwise it's not an album that precisely gives me a lot to discuss. But it is probably the post-Lucid side project album that I've had the easiest time coming back to and enjoying. It's the one that best accomplishes exactly what it set out to do. Unlike Astral Bridge, where I felt more deja vu than I did having an uplifting experience, this one feels like it has a better fleshed out sound, and I can enjoy it for that kind of ambient mindset that he was going for. I think it's also promising that both side project names give me an improved and refined version of their sound with their second iterations. Or I guess Fractal Labyrinth is technically his third under this name, but you get what I mean. So yeah, not much else for me to say on this album. I enjoyed it a fair bit, and I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Cameron Limbrick side projects and more obscure works. As promised, here's the list of my top 10 favorite tracks of his without further commentary. Number 10, Rise Above from Lucid. Number 9, Baby I Saw a UFO from Unfold. Number 8, Dimension Shift from Uplift Drift. Number 7, Photonic Phonic from Uplift Drift. Number 6, Love is the Key from Lucid. Number 5, The World is an Illusion from Observer. Number 4, Shadows on the Wall from Lucid. Number 3, Levitation Groove from Uplift Drift. Number 2, Cosmic Consciousness from Freedom Star. Here's a list of my honorable mentions. Number 1, Risen City of Electro from Freedom Star. So yeah, that's the end of this series. Of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. If you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.